the point where we have 3 kids, and for the first time, all of our kids were in school. And so I kind of joke around that I kind of had a midlife crisis, but I really just needed something more in my life, and I wasn't sure what that was. I love reading. I read all different kinds of books, and I think it's really helped me as a writer just to read different genres and different writing styles. And so really about 4 or 5 years ago, I took a community ed writing class in town. And in the class, we did a writing prompt. And what the teacher had us do, he had us close our eyes and visualize walking through our dream house. And so we would walk through our dream house, and he would have us imagine what the walls looked like, what they were painted, how the floor felt beneath our feet. You know, was it a creaky floor or a wooden floor? What the kitchen looked like and the countertops. And so we did this visualization process where we walked through our dream house. And when we walked down the stairs to the basement, everything was empty. And as you're walking through the basement, all of a sudden in the corner of the basement, something catches your eye, and it's a chest or a trunk. And so we walked over to the trunk, and when we opened up the trunk, he wanted us to write down the first 4 items that came to mind of what was in the trunk. And it could have been anything. It could have been a field of flowers, a sky full of stars, or it could have been tangible items, you know, of whatever you could think of. So oddly enough, my items were sand, seashells, a Japanese photo album, and an old yellowed wedding dress. And so our first assignment was to take these items, as unrelated as they were, and to put them into the form of a poem. So I won't read the poem I came up with. I'm definitely not a poet. But we put these items into a poem. And then when we came back the following week, our job was to put these items into a short story. And so that short story turned into a 242-page novel about 3 to 4 years later. So if I just take the first page of the book, my first sentence of the novel, it's Santa Ana, California, November 1941. Alu Noguchi turned the seashells over in her hand, blowing remnants of stubborn sand from the hollows as she traced the rigid markings the ocean had left upon their surface. It was the point of the morning when the sun met the sky with an orange glow. Hard to imagine there was a war happening on the other side of the world. They're beauties, Mama said, as she dumped the seashells on the weathered floorboards. So it was pretty amazing to me how this instructor was able to teach us how to write and really just teach us how to kind of pull into our subconscious mind and pull out these bits of material and these things we visualized in this treasure chest and put them into a story form. So really with Becoming American, I worked on it over a period of about 3 years. I would work on it, put it away for months, come back to it, and work on it mostly at night. I don't sleep very well, so it was a project I worked on at night quite a bit. And how I I found a publisher out of Green Bay. I really love working with her. She had been an editor for about 20 years, and she started her own publishing firm a couple of years back. And it was really nice working with her, being a smaller agency, because I had a lot of freedom to come up with the cover art and a lot of the creative freedom that you usually don't have with a big publisher. But what happened is about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, about 3 weeks before the manuscript was due, I'd been working on it for years. I thought everything was done. And at that point, the main storyline, the only storyline, revolved around Alu, who is a young teenage American, Japanese American girl, and her family being sent to an internment camp in California. And so my husband and I had the opportunity to go to Hawaii and visit with a friend and stay with her. And while we were there, I was able to meet up with the 100th Battalion. And I'll talk a little bit more about them in a while, a little bit. But after meeting up with them and hearing their story, I came back home, and after working on this for years, I looked at my husband and he looked at me, and I said, don't say it. I know what you're going to say. And I had to include that storyline. It was just too important of a storyline in the Japanese American World War II experience to not include. So I pulled a lot of all-nighters, and basically in 1 to 2 weeks, I came up with a new storyline of Yukio's character and the battalions, and then I added that military component to the book, which most people tell me ended up being their favorite character, and it's the one that I came up with kind of under the gun. So, but I wanted to get into a little bit about the history of the book. As Jeanette had told me, the summer library theme, the library program theme, is imagining your story. And so in imagining your story, I just want to ask and want you to think about, if you were putting together your family story, for example, what would that look like if you didn't have any pictures? Or let's say you didn't have any heirlooms or journals or letters from your past. Would your story be the same? And how would you go about piecing together your family story and your heritage if it had all been taken away from you, or quite a bit of it? So most of us know the story of the Pearl Harbor attack, that on December 7th, 1941, it was a quiet Sunday morning in Oahu. A war alert had just been lifted, and the planes were parked wingtip to wingtip on Wheeler Field. So when a couple of planes were spotted flying into the island that morning, a general by the name of General Short, right here, he was in charge of keeping the island safe, and he was in charge of Oahu. He had dismissed those planes as American planes. And the tragedy of that, the results were catastrophic. So the island was lit with fire. There were 2 waves of the Japanese Imperial Navy, which came in. They destroyed 20 vessels, 8 battleships, 200 planes destroyed, and really created a series of events from there forward. So what I found is we learn about Pearl Harbor in school, and we learn about the horrors of the Holocaust during World War II. But one aspect they really don't teach much about is what it was like to be a Japanese American during that time. And so what happened, this created a series of events once Pearl Harbor was bombed. December 8th, the United States entered World War II. So this General Emmons over here replaced General Short on the island of Oahu. General Short was very quickly removed from his position. And so the United States enters the war. And by January, if you were a Japanese American, things really start to change quickly for you. And as I tell my kids, how I explained it to them, imagine it wasn't Japan who bombed Pearl Harbor. Let's say it was Norway, for example. We're Norwegian, so it's easier for them to think of it that way. All of a sudden, there's a curfew. You have to be home by a certain time. And a lot of the men in the community start disappearing. So you might come home from school one day and your dad is gone and you're not sure where he went or how long they'll have him. So a curfew is put in place, and they start pulling Japanese American, mostly men first. So business owners, teachers, pastors, anyone whom the government feels is influential. And our kids always ask me, they say, yeah, but we're not Norwegian, Mom. We've never even been to Norway. And I tell them, but most of these families, most of these kids had never been to Japan. They were born in the United States. So the FBI came into different people's houses and they'd knock on the door and they'd come in and they ask you questions such as, how much money do you think you are worth in this country? How many times did you go to church last year? What church do you belong to? What do you think about the Japanese-Chinese War? Who do you want to win this war? You don't want to see Japan lose. Do your children speak Japanese? So they would ask hundreds of questions, and these are actual questions I had gotten from somebody I had sat down with and heard her family story, and I'll talk a little bit more about her later. But this is an open file, a file from the FBI, and it was ordered by John Edgar Hoover, who at the time was the director of the FBI. And so they would come in and they'd ask hundreds of questions. And despite what you answered, at the end, they would, most of the time, almost all of the time, if you lived on the West Coast, they would deem you an enemy alien of the US, and they would recommend you for removal from the community. At the same time, anti-Japanese sentiment started settling in the US. So the newspapers really started printing a lot of really horrible cartoons. And for a Japanese American living in the United States during that time, it really created a lot of racism towards them. A lot of businesses shut down. There's a lot of exclusion, a lot of hate-filled comments. And so there were a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment settling in during that time. So by February of 1942, a man by the name of General DeWitt over here, he held what was General Short's position, but on the West Coast for California. And so what he did at the time, he was worried about his job. He had seen what had happened with General Short. And in fear of losing his job, he had convinced FDR to put together the Executive Order 9066. And what the Executive Order did was it ordered over almost 120,000 Japanese Americans into internment camps. And the Japanese American families who were ordered, they were given 2 days, roughly 2 days, to basically put together 2 seed bags of belongings, having no idea where they were being sent to, nor how long, nor what to pack. And they went all the way as to pull babies and kids out of orphanages, and anybody who was 1/8 Japanese were sent to these internment camps. So the internment camps, there were 10 of them throughout the United States, including one in Honolulu. They knew they couldn't intern a lot of Japanese Americans on Honolulu or on Oahu because it would collapse their economy. And so they were sent to these internment camps, and most of them were located in old fairgrounds, old Native American reservations, old racetracks. And a lot of them were very uncomfortable weather conditions. So deserts, really hot during the day, really cold at night. And really a lot of them started their heritage, their ethnicity, their pride in who they were. Some of that started to break down a little bit. Women, a lot of women couldn't cook at the camps. There were army cooks. And children would run around mess halls. Families didn't sit together or eat together. And they were living at a lot of these camps, particularly Manzanar, which is the one I write about in the book. They were living in animal stalls, cleaned out animal stalls with 2 or 3 other families they didn't know. So really these camps were they weren't comfortable. They didn't have the warm clothes. They weren't properly packed for it. And they were not comfortable situations. So this executive order that sent the Japanese Americans to camp posed a couple problems for the government. Number one, on the island of Oahu, as I mentioned, the economy would collapse if they interned all of the Japanese Americans. So what the government did do, they took away the guns from the ROTC. And so the ROTC unit in turn formed the Varsity Victory Volunteer Group, and they would do whatever they could to help with the war effort. They rebuilt roads, put up bridges, really whatever they could do. But there's also a group called the Hawaiian Territorial Guard, and the government had no idea what to do with these guys. Most of them were college graduates. upper 20s, married families, and they had been part of the military for quite a while, most of them born in the United States, born in Hawaii. And so they asked, well, what do we do with these guys? We can't send them to internment camps. They're part of our military. And so what they did, they gave them a couple days notice, and they told them to quietly pack their bags. They didn't tell them where they were going. And they got on ships. Many of these guys feared they were being sent to Japan, a country they had never seen, and denounced citizenship from the US. And what they did, they sent them on ships, and they woke up in California. So they were grateful to be crossing under the Golden Gate Bridge. They docked in Oakland, California, and they were told to get on trains during the night and to pull the shades closed. They were going through California, which was General DeWitt's area, and it would have looked really bad for him to put all these families into internment camps and then allow all these Japanese Americans to go through California by train. So they still didn't know where they were going. And believe it or not, they woke up in Wisconsin. So these are guys who mostly had not been off the island of Oahu. And I can't even imagine the culture shock of ending up in Wisconsin. So these are some of my favorite pictures at Fort McCoy. But I had read a lot of their personal accounts, and a lot of these men said that Wisconsin opened them with welcome arms at a time where they weren't welcome, most places on the mainland, especially not on the West Coast. They developed a lot of friendships in Wisconsin with local families,